If you've ever been sitting in a queue at a petrol station, engine idling, waiting your turn for a free pump, and later found a parking charge notice waiting for you at home, you're not alone, and the competition watchdog has just confirmed it's taking this seriously. Let's break down exactly what's being investigated, what it actually means if you've been caught by this, and whether you're genuinely owed anything right now, or whether that's still further down the road. The Competition and Markets Authority has formally opened an investigation into Euro car parks, one of the largest private parking operators in the country, running more than 3,000 locations across the UK and Ireland and handling somewhere in the region of 2 million vehicles passing through its sites every single day. The investigation opened on the 15th of July, and it's focused specifically on one question worth stating plainly. Is it lawful and fair to issue a parking charge to a driver who's simply queuing to reach a fuel pump or waiting to use a service like a car wash, rather than someone who's actually parked and using the space for something else entirely? Here's why this matters at the scale it does. Each individual ticket issued in these circumstances typically runs up to £100, and given the volume of vehicles passing through petrol station forecourts operated under this kind of parking management every single day, the RAC has estimated the potential daily exposure across the industry could run into millions of pounds if this pattern is happening as widely as complaints suggest. That's not a confirmed figure of money already collected specifically from queuing drivers. It's an illustration of just how much money is potentially moving through exactly this kind of charge if the practice turns out to be as widespread as the complaints driving this investigation indicate. It's worth understanding the CMA's own Executive Director of Consumer Protection has been fairly blunt about the message behind this, saying plainly that it's time for private parking operators to comply with consumer law or risk action from the regulator. That's a message aimed at the entire industry, not solely at Euro car parks, and it's part of why this investigation is being watched closely by consumer groups and motoring organizations well beyond just the customers of this one specific company. Both the RAC and the AA have weighed in publicly and specifically, worth quoting directly because it captures exactly the frustration driving this whole story. The RAC's head of policy called the CMA's involvement a major step forward, pointing out that drivers aren't consistently getting fair outcomes when they try to challenge a ticket in the first place. The AA's head of roads policy put it even more plainly, noting that drivers are already feeling the pinch from rising fuel prices, and the last thing anyone wants or expects is to be hit with a parking charge purely for sitting in a queue waiting their turn. Now here's where I need to be genuinely careful with you, because this is exactly the kind of story where the honest answer to "Are you owed money?" is more nuanced than a simple yes. This is an open investigation, not a completed enforcement action, and not a confirmed finding that Euro car parks has actually broken the law. The CMA's evidence-gathering phase is expected to run until spring of next year, which means there's no automatic refund process, no compensation scheme, and no confirmed wrongdoing established yet. If you've seen headlines suggesting drivers are already being refunded en masse, that's ahead of where this genuinely stands right now. There's a separate detail worth being precise about too, because it's easy to conflate two different things happening with this same company. Euro car parks was separately fined £473,000 by the CMA, but that penalty was specifically for failing to respond to a legally binding information request, not for the underlying issue of fining drivers who were queuing. The CMA has been explicit that this earlier fine doesn't itself represent any finding that the company has infringed consumer protection law. It was purely a penalty for non-cooperation with the regulator's evidence-gathering process. The actual substantive question, whether charging queuing drivers is lawful in the first place, is precisely what this new investigation is now working through. So if a formal finding and compensation scheme aren't confirmed yet, what can you actually do right now if you believe you've been unfairly charged specifically for queuing rather than genuinely parking? This is where it's worth remembering the protections that already exist under the wider private parking single code of practice, regardless of how this specific CMA investigation eventually resolves. Every driver is entitled to a minimum 5-minute consideration period on arrival at any car park before any charge clock can start, giving you time to assess the situation before committing to anything. Beyond that, and specifically relevant here, camera and ANPR evidence is only supposed to generate a valid charge for a vehicle that's genuinely parked, not one that's simply paused or queuing while waiting to reach a pump or service. If your vehicle never actually stopped for the purpose of parking and was instead moving slowly through a queue toward a fuel pump, that's a legitimate basis to challenge any charge issued on exactly that ground, independent of whatever the CMA investigation eventually concludes. If you believe you've been charged in circumstances that sound exactly like what this investigation is examining, here's the practical route worth taking today, rather than waiting for the investigation to conclude. Challenge the charge directly with the operator first, specifically citing that your vehicle was queuing for fuel or a forecourt service rather than genuinely parked, and reference the requirement that camera evidence only validly applies to actually parked vehicles under the code. If that initial challenge is rejected, you're entitled to escalate to the single independent appeals service that now covers the entire private parking sector, and operators are required to accept whatever determination that service reaches. This route exists and is available right now, entirely separate from whatever timeline the CMA's own investigation ultimately runs on. There's also a broader piece of this story worth knowing, because the CMA hasn't limited its response purely to opening an investigation into one company. Alongside launching this inquiry, the regulator has published an open letter to the government, specifically calling for a review into how consideration and grace periods work across the private parking sector more broadly. That's a meaningfully bigger ask than just resolving one company's practices. It's pushing for the underlying rules themselves to be reconsidered, which suggests the CMA sees this Euro car parks case as symptomatic of a wider pattern across the industry rather than an isolated issue with a single operator. It's worth thinking about why forecourts end up using this kind of parking management at all, since it's easy to assume it's purely about catching genuine misuse of the space. Petrol stations and their associated shops do have legitimate reasons to manage how long vehicles occupy space on their forecourt, preventing someone from parking indefinitely and blocking pumps for other customers, or discouraging people from using the car park purely as free all-day parking while they go elsewhere. The genuine complaint here isn't that this kind of management shouldn't exist at all. It's specifically that the systems in place aren't always distinguishing properly between a vehicle genuinely misusing the space and one that's simply queuing in an orderly fashion to actually use the fuel pump the forecourt exists to provide in the first place. It's worth understanding a bit more about how Euro Car Parks actually operates its enforcement technology, because it explains why this specific pattern of complaint has emerged at the scale it has. The company relies heavily on automatic number plate recognition cameras positioned at entry and exit points, automatically logging every vehicle's arrival and departure time without any human reviewing individual cases before a charge gets generated. That's efficient at scale, processing the sheer volume of vehicles moving through thousands of sites daily, but it also means the system is fundamentally working from timestamps alone, arrival time versus departure time, with no inherent way to distinguish between a car that spent 15 minutes queuing in an orderly line toward a pump and one that spent the same 15 minutes parked illegitimately elsewhere on the site. That structural limitation in purely camera-based enforcement is precisely the kind of issue the CMA's investigation is now examining in detail. There's also a wider pattern worth being aware of if you use petrol station forecourts regularly, because Euro Car Parks isn't the only operator running this kind of ANPR-based system at fuel stations. If you've had a similar experience with a different parking operator entirely, the same underlying protections under the single code of practice still apply regardless of which specific company issued the charge. The consideration period and genuinely parked vehicle requirements aren't unique to Euro Car Parks. They're baseline protections that cover the entire private parking sector, which means the challenge route we've covered today is worth pursuing regardless of whose name happens to be on the charge notice you've received. If you're currently sitting on an unpaid charge you believe falls into exactly this category, don't simply pay it to make the letters stop while this investigation runs its course. Document the circumstances as best you can. Screenshots of any timestamps involved, your own recollection of when you actually arrived versus when you reached the pump, and pursue the existing challenge and appeals process rather than assuming there's no point until the CMA investigation formally concludes. The existing code of practice protections don't depend on this specific investigation reaching any particular outcome. They already apply today, regardless of how this story develops from here. So let's bring this together into something you can actually act on rather than just something to feel vindicated by. If you've been charged specifically for queuing at a petrol station or similar forecourt service, you can challenge that charge right now using the existing consideration period and genuinely parked vehicle protections under the code. You don't need to wait for the CMA investigation to conclude. If your challenge is rejected, escalate to the independent appeals service rather than assuming the operator's decision is final. Keep an eye on this story specifically if you regularly use forecourts managed by Euro Car Parks or similar operators, since the CMA's broader push for a government review of grace periods could genuinely reshape how this works across the entire industry, not just for this one company. And if you're currently facing an unpaid charge you believe fits this exact pattern, don't pay it purely to make it go away without at least attempting a proper challenge first. None of this is designed to suggest every parking charge issued at a petrol station is automatically wrong. Plenty are issued for genuine misuse of the space that has nothing to do with queuing for fuel. But the specific pattern this investigation is examining, drivers penalized purely for waiting their turn in an orderly queue, is exactly the kind of practice existing consumer protections were already designed to prevent, and you don't need to wait for a regulator's finding months from now to start using the tools that already exist today. It's worth ending on what genuinely happens next with this investigation, because it's worth having realistic expectations about the timeline, rather than checking for updates every week expecting a sudden resolution. Evidence-gathering investigations of this kind typically involve the CMA formally requesting documentation and data from the company under investigation, analyzing patterns across a large volume of individual cases, and potentially consulting with consumer groups and industry bodies before reaching any provisional findings. Given the evidence-gathering phase alone is expected to run into next spring, any formal outcome, whether that's enforcement action, a change in industry practice, or a compensation scheme for affected drivers, realistically sits considerably further out than that. That's not a reason to ignore this story, but it is a reason to rely on the protections already available today, rather than waiting for this specific process to deliver an answer. If this helped you understand exactly where this story genuinely stands and what you can actually do about it right now, hit subscribe, because I'll be covering this investigation as it develops, along with the outcome of the CMA's wider push for grace period reform. Regulatory stories like this one tend to move slowly and quietly compared to how dramatically they get reported in the first few days, and I'll keep tracking it properly rather than letting it disappear from coverage the moment the initial headlines fade. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.